All right. Hi there, everybody. So I decided I'm going to make my own recording on how to do some of the problems that I've assigned. I think the Khan Academy videos are great, but I think that um, I certainly know you all better as students, and I might be able to give a little bit more of a personal touch on what we're doing here. So one of the things that we've been focusing on is converting fractions to decimals to percents. So I'm going to give a little bit of notes and then do an example or two for each type here. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at fractions to decimals. Okay, so here it says, when given a fraction, simply divide the numerator, but it should say by the denominator in your calculator to convert to decimal form. So I'm going to see if I can draw here. Perfect. So let's say I have 2 out of 10, right? 2/10. So once we get the hang of this, there's going to be a couple fractions that we know really, really well, and we're going to just start to memorize some things. So this might be one of those that we'll start to memorize. But the easiest thing we can do is take our calculator and do 2, the numerator, divided by 10, our denominator, and we get 0.2. Right? So if we read this fraction, we call it 2/10. And if we read this decimal, we also call it 2/10. So that is rather simple for us to remember, right? But let's say we have a different fraction. Maybe we have 6/8, right? So we don't necessarily know what that's going to look like as a decimal. So we take our calculator and we're going to do 6, the numerator, divided by 8, the denominator, and we get 0.75. Now there's a lot of different ways we can go about doing things. We could have simplified 6/8 into a smaller fraction, and that might have been something we could have used. But simple as simple can be, we divide the numerator by the denominator in our calculator. Good? Okay, so I'm going to erase this here. Good. And we're going to move on to our next number types. So here we're going to look at decimals to fractions. So when given a decimal, you rewrite it as a whole number over its place value, then simply simplify to convert to a fraction. Okay, so what that really means here is, let's get our drawing tool again. What I mean when I say take a whole number over its place value is, let's take that 2/10 again that we saw before. Right? We know that this is the 10th place. So we can take 2 and we can write it over tenths, right? So if we simplify this, we know that 2 goes into 2 and 2 also goes into 10, and this can simplify to 1/5, right? We always want to simplify. Always want to leave our answers in the simplest form possible. Okay, so let me erase this and we're going to look at another example. Okay, so let's look at, oops, there, we need a drawing tool to draw. 0.25. All right, so we know this is the 10th place. This is the 100th place. Okay, so we know this is the 100th place. So we will take 25 right, our whole number, and put it over 100, right? So these both tell us 25/100ths as a decimal and as a fraction. So we know if we say both the names of these values, they're exactly the same. Okay. So if we take a look, we can simplify 25/100, right? If we think about our money system, and we think of this as 25 cents out of $1, 25 cents is 1/4 or 1/4, right? We can also think of this as how many times 25 goes into 100. That would be 125 going in 4 times. Okay, so let's erase all of this and we'll move on to our third option here. Now let's take a look. Decimals to percents. When given a decimal, simply move the decimal point 2 places to the left and add a percent sign to convert to a percent. So this might be our simplest task to do. So we'll take any decimal. Let's keep going back to our 2/10. Okay, and we find our decimal point right here, and we're going to move it 1, 2 places to the, sorry about that, this should be the right. Not the left, the right. Okay, so once we move that, we see that we need to add in a 0 for a placeholder here. And this becomes 20%. We add in our percent sign right there. Let's look at a bit more of a challenging number to start. Scoot over here a bit. So let's look at, what if we have 0.8362? All right, a little messy there. So our instructions are exactly the same. We take our decimal point and we move it 2 places to the right, not the left. Sorry about that. We move it to the right. So we always want to be going bigger here. 1, 2. So now we have, move this up here, 83.62%. Pretty simple. No matter if we have something as simple as this first question or complicated like this next decimal, we still use the same instructions every time. And remember, we're doing the right, not the left, like I originally said. Okay. Move on to our last fractions to percents. When given a fraction, you can either convert to a decimal first, right? So you have 2 options here. You can convert to a decimal, then into a percent like we just learned how to do, or an option here, you can use the percent proportion to convert to a percent. So the beginning of the year, Mr. Wenz was teaching, and he worked on percents, or not percents, proportions, ratios and proportions with you guys. So I'm going to go through that again because I know it's been a long time since we've done that. So first, let's look at, let's say we're given 1/4. And we want to convert, let's try our first option, option 1. Convert to a decimal first, then a percent. So if we remember, we convert from a fraction to a decimal by simply dividing the numerator 1 by the denominator 4. And this is going to give us 0.25, right? A quarter. No worries there. So to take this decimal and now make it a percent, we take our decimal point and we move it 1, 2 spaces to the right. And we are going to get 25, pull up our percent sign on, percent. Okay, so that's probably one of the simpler ways to do it. Oops, wrong way. Now I'm going to take the same fraction and I'm going to show you how we can do it with our percent proportion. So I'm going to erase this. And we're going to look at how we can do this with our second option. Oops, what did I do? Our second option here. So we can do a percent proportion. And what that means is a proportion is really setting two fractions equal to each other. They're proportional. So that means that if we think about a percent, we know that all percents are out of 100. Right? That's what we should always know. Everything should add up to 100. So our percents are always out of 100. So we know that to make this a percent, 1/4 here is going to have to equal some number over 100. So what we can do is we can say 1/4 is equal to some percent out of 100. But we usually indicate, which you're all very good at, an unknown as a variable, right? So those skills we have from solving equations are never ever going to leave us. We're always going to need those. So we can call this x. And if you remember from your ratios and proportions unit with Mr. Wenz, what we do here, let's see if I can erase this. What we do here when we have two fractions set equal to each other with an unknown, which is x, we are going to cross multiply. Now you can only cross multiply when you have an equal sign in between two fractions. If I have this, that's a multiplication sign. That is not an equal sign. This I cannot cross multiply. Only when there's an equal sign. Okay? So you have to remember that. It's a very common mistake, so no stress if it happens. We just pick it back up from the beginning. So we're going to cross multiply. So here we have 4 times x is going to give us 4x. Actually, excuse me, let me write it down here where I have more room. We have 4x. And then 1 times 100 is going to give us 100. Now we have a one-step equation to solve. So we see multiplication right here. That means we're going to divide. And whatever we do to one side, we do it to another, because we know that an equation is just like a balance beam, right? If we do something to one side and not the other, our balance is going to fall. So we always keep that balance. So 4x divided by 4 gives us 1x, which we will write as x. And 100 divided by 4 is going to give us 25. So now we have to just make sure we include our percent sign. And we have found that 1/4 is equal to 25%. Okay. Now, one more thing, one last thing that I wanted to mention. We did decimals to fractions, decimals to percents, fractions to decimals, and fractions to percents. But what about if we do the opposite of this right here? So let's look at our decimals to percents. If we do percent to decimal, now we have to write this again, right? This should be to the right. But let's take our 25% since we've already been working with it. Let's say we have 25%. If we're going to convert that to a decimal, it might seem a little obvious to some right now because I may have written it already incorrectly, but if we take 25% and we want to go backwards, right, we're doing the opposite of this. We're going from percent to decimal. We're going to do the opposite of what we're needed. So here we do the right. If we're doing the opposite, we're going to move to the left. So we take our decimal point, it's a different color here, and we move 1, 2 to the left. And we get 0.25, which we should say is 0.25, right? So all we're doing is the exact opposite of what we're doing for decimals to percents. We take away the percent sign, and we're going to move 2 places to the left. Okay, so let's just look at one more, and then we'll be finished here. So let's take maybe 36.1%. If we do this, if we want to make this as a decimal, we find our decimal point, and we're going to move it 1, 2 places to the left, and we're going to knock off that percent sign. So that's going to become 0.361 as a decimal. All right, so that's going to be the end of our notes here. You can re-watch this recording and re-listen to this recording at any time. I know it's a bit long, so you can pause it, rewind it, whatever you need to do to get through some of the practice problems. Okay, so thanks so much for listening, and please let me know your feedback. If you want some more images, less of me writing, whatever you think is going to help you the most, please let me know. All right, bye-bye, guys.